Hello, Year 6. Hope you're keeping well and busy, of course. Mrs. Ellis and I are missing you lots and thought by now that you might be missing us too, so I've decided to read you a story. The story I've chosen is an extract from one of my favourite books by Roald Dahl called Boy Tales of Childhood. It's an anthology, really, of some stories of Roald Dahl in his young years, from when he was a little boy all the way to senior age. And it's an anthology or collection of some tales. Really recommend the book, very, very funny, and it makes you realise where he got some of his ideas for popular books like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So the story that I've chosen to read you today is called The Great Mouse Plot. The sweet shop in Llandaff in the year 1923 was the very centre of our lives. Without it, there would have been little to live for. But it did have one terrible drawback. The woman who owned it was a real horror. We hated her and we had good reason for doing so. Her name was Mrs. Pratchett. She was a skinny old hag with a moustache on her upper lip and a mouth as sour as a green gooseberry. She never smiled, she never welcomed us when we went in, and the only times that she spoke were when she said things like, "I'm watching you, so you keep your thieving fingers off them chocolates." "I don't want you in here just to look around. Either you forks out or you gets out." But by far the most loathsome thing about Mrs. Pratchett was the filth that clung around her. Her apron was grey and greasy. Her blouse had bits of breakfast all over it. Toast crumbs and tea stains and splotches of dried egg yolk. But it was her hands, however, that disturbed us the most. They were disgusting. They were black with dirt and grime, and they looked as though they had been putting lumps of coal on the fire all day long. And do not forget, please, that it was these very hands and fingers that she plunged into the sweet jars when we asked her for a pennyworth of treacle toffee, or wine gums, or nut clusters, or whatever. There were precious few health laws in those days, and nobody, least of all Mrs. Pratchett, ever thought of using a little shovel for getting out the sweets as they do today. The mere sight of her grimy right hand with its black fingernails digging an ounce of chocolate fudge out of a jar would have caused a starving tramp to go running from the shop. But not us. Sweets were our lifeblood. We would have put up with far worse than that to get them. So we simply stood and watched in sullen silence while this disgusting old woman stirred around inside the jars with her foul fingers. The other thing that we hated Mrs. Pratchett for was her meanness. Because unless you spent a whole sixpence all in one go, she wouldn't give you a bag, and instead you got your sweets twisted up in a small piece of newspaper which she tore off a pile of old Daily Mirrors lying on the counter. So you can well understand that we had it in for Mrs. Pratchett in a big way, but we didn't quite know what to do about it. Many schemes were put forward, but none of them was any good. None of them, that is, until suddenly, one memorable afternoon, we found the dead mouse. My 4 friends and I had come across a loose floorboard at the back of the classroom, and when we prized it up with the blade of a pocket knife, we discovered a big hollow space underneath. This, we decided, would be our secret hiding place for sweets and other small treasures such as conkers and monkey nuts and birds' eggs. Every afternoon, when the last lesson was over, the 5 of us would wait until the classroom had emptied, and then we would lift up the floorboard and examine our secret hoard, perhaps adding to it or taking something away. One day, when we lifted it up, we found a dead mouse lying among our treasures. It was an exciting discovery. Thwaites took it out by its tail and waved it in front of our faces. "So what shall we do with it?" he cried. "Oh, it stinks," someone shouted. "Throw it out of the window, quick." "Hold on a tick," I said. Don't throw it away." Thwaites hesitated, and they all looked at me. When writing about oneself, one must strive to be truthful. Truth is more important than modesty. I must tell you, therefore, that it was I, and I alone, who had the idea for the great and daring mouse plot. We all have our moments of brilliance and glory, and this was mine. "Why don't we," I said, "why don't we slip it into one of Mrs. Pratchett's jars of sweets, and then when she puts her dirty hand in to grab a handful, she'll grab a stinky dead mouse instead?" The other 4 stared at me in wonder. Then, as the sheer genius of the plot began to sink in, they all started grinning. They slapped me on the back, they cheered me and danced around the classroom. "We'll do it today," they cried. "We'll do it on the way home. You had the idea," they said to me, "so you can be the one to put the mouse in the jar." Thwaites handed me the mouse. I put it into my trouser pocket, and then the 5 of us left the school, crossed the village green, and headed for the sweet shop. We were tremendously jazzed up. We felt a bit like a gang of desperados setting out to rob a train or blow up the sheriff's office. "Make sure you put it into a jar which is used often," somebody said. "I'm putting it in the Gobstoppers," I said. "The Gobstopper jar is never behind the counter." "I've got a penny," Thwaites said, "so I'll ask for 1 sherbet sucker and 1 bootlace, and while she turns away to get them, you slip the mouse in quickly in with the Gobstoppers." Thus everything was arranged. We were strutting a little as we entered the shop. We were the victors now, and Mrs. Pratchett was the victim. She stood behind the counter, and her small, malignant pig eyes watched us suspiciously as we came forward. "1 sherbet sucker, please," Thwaites said to her, holding out his penny. I kept to the rear of the group, and when I saw Mrs. Pratchett turn her head away for a couple of seconds to fish a sherbet sucker out of the box, I lifted the heavy glass lid of the Gobstopper jar and I dropped the mouse in. Then I replaced the lid as silently as possible. My heart was thumping like mad and my hands had gone all sweaty. "And 1 bootlace, please," I heard Thwaites saying. And when I turned around, I saw Mrs. Pratchett holding out the bootlace in her filthy fingers. "I don't want all the lot of you trooping in here if only one of you is buying," she screamed at us. "Now beat it! Go on, get out!" And as soon as we were outside, we broke into a run. "Did you do it?" they shouted at me. "Of course I did," I said. "Well done you," I cried. "What a super show!" I felt like a hero. I was a hero. It was marvellous to be so popular. The flush of triumph over the dead mouse was carried forward to the next morning as we all met again to walk to school. "Come on, let's go in and see if it's still in the jar," somebody said as we approached the sweet shop. "Don't," Thwaites said firmly. "It's too dangerous. Walk past as though nothing has happened." And as we came level with the shop, we saw a cardboard notice hanging on the door. Closed. We stopped and stared. We had never known the sweet shop to be closed at this time of the morning, even on Sundays. "What's happened?" we asked each other. "What's going on?" We pressed our faces against the window and looked inside. Mrs. Pratchett was nowhere to be seen. "Look," I cried. "Look, the Gobstopper jar. It's gone. It's not on the shelf. There's a gap where it used to be." "It's on the floor," someone said. "It's smashed to bits and there's Gobstoppers absolutely everywhere." "And there's the mouse," someone shouted. We could see it all. The huge glass jar smashed to smithereens with the dead mouse lying in the wreckage and hundreds of many-coloured Gobstoppers littering the floor. "She got such a shock when she grabbed hold of the mouse that she dropped everything," somebody was saying. "But why didn't she just sweep it all up and open the shop?" Nobody answered me. I turned away and I walked towards the school. All of a sudden we had begun to feel slightly uncomfortable. There was something not quite right about the shop being closed. Even Thwaites was unable to offer a reasonable explanation. We became silent. There was a faint scent of danger in the air now. Each one of us had caught a whiff of it. Alarm bells were beginning to ring faintly in our ears. After a while, Thwaites broke the silence. "She must have got one heck of a shock," he said. He paused. We all looked at him, wondering what wisdom this great medical authority was going to come out with next. "After all," he went on, "to catch hold of a dead mouse when you're expecting to catch hold of a gobstopper must be a pretty frightening experience. Don't you agree?" Nobody answered him. "Well now," Thwaites went on, "when an old person like Mrs. Pratchett suddenly gets a very big shock, I suppose you know what happens next." "What?" we said. What happens?" "You ask my father," Thwaites said. "He'll tell you." No, you tell us," we said. "Give us a heart attack," Thwaites announced. "Her heart stops beating and she's dead in 5 seconds. For a moment or two, my own heart stopped beating. Thwaites pointed a finger at me and said darkly, "I'm afraid you killed her." "Me?" I cried. "Well, why just me?" "Well, it was your idea," he said, "and what's more, you put the mouse in." All of a sudden, I was a murderer. At exactly that point we heard the school bell ringing in the distance, and we had to gallop the rest of the way so as not to be late for prayers. Prayers were held in the assembly hall. We all perched in rows on wooden benches while the teachers sat up on the platform in armchairs facing us. The 5 of us scrambled into our places just as the headmaster marched in, followed by the rest of the staff. The headmaster is the only teacher at Llandaff Cathedral School that I can remember, and for a reason you will soon discover. I can remember him very clearly indeed. His name was Mr. Coombs, and I have a picture in my mind of a giant of a man with a face like a ham and a mass of rusty-coloured hair that sprouted in a tangle all over the top of his head. All grown-ups appear as giants to small children, but headmasters and policemen are the biggest giants of all and acquire a marvellously exaggerated stature. It is possible that Mr. Coombs was a perfectly normal being, but in my memory he was a giant, a tweed-suited giant who always wore a black gown over his tweeds and a waistcoat under his jacket. Mr. Coombs now proceeded to mumble through the same old prayers that we had every day, but this morning, when the last Amen had been spoken, he didn't turn and lead his group rapidly out of the hall as usual. He remained standing before us, and it was clear that he had an announcement to make. The whole school is to go out and line up around the playground immediately. Leave your books behind and no talking. Mr. Coombs was looking grim. His hammy pink face had taken on that dangerous scowl which only appeared when he was extremely cross and somebody was for the high jump. I sat there small and frightened among the rows and rows of other boys, and to me at that moment the headmaster, with his black gown draped over his shoulders, was like a judge at a murder trial. He's after the killer, Thwaites whispered to me. I began to shiver. I bet the police are here already, Thwaites went on, and the Black Mariah's waiting outside. As we made our way out to the playground, my whole stomach began to feel as though it was slowly filling up with swirling water. I am only 8 years old, I told myself. No little boy of 8 has ever murdered anyone. It's just not possible. Out in the playground on this warm, cloudy September morning, the deputy headmaster was shouting, "Line up in forms! 6th form there, 5th form there, spread out, get on with it!" Thwaites and I and my other 3 friends were in the 2nd form, the lowest but one, and we lined up against the red brick wall of the playground, shoulder to shoulder. I can remember that when every boy in the school was in his place, the line stretched right around the 4 sides of the playground, about 100 small boys altogether. They were aged between 6 and 12, all of us wearing identical grey shorts, blazers, socks and black shoes. But why, for heaven's sake, were we in the playground at all, I wondered? And why were we lined up like this? I mean, it had never happened before. I half expected to see 2 policemen come bounding out of the school to grab me by the arms and put handcuffs on my wrists. A single door led out from the school onto the playground. Suddenly it swung open, and through it, like the angel of death, strode Mr. Coombs, huge and bulky in his tweed suit and black gown. And beside him, believe it or not, right beside him trotted the tiny figure of Mrs. Pratchett herself. Mrs. Pratchett was alive! The relief was tremendous. "She's alive!" I whispered to Thwaites, standing next to me. I didn't kill her. Thwaites ignored me. "We'll start over here," Mr. Coombs was saying to Mrs. Pratchett. He grasped her by one of her skinny arms and led her over to where the 6th form was standing. Then, still keeping hold of her arm, he proceeded to lead her at a brisk walk along the line of the boys. It was like someone inspecting the troops. "What on earth are they doing?" I whispered. Thwaites didn't answer me. I glanced at him. He had gone rather pale. "Too big," I heard Mrs. Pratchett say. "Much too big. It's none of this lot. Let's have a look at them ones over there, those titchy ones." Mr. Coombs increased his pace. "We'd better go all the way around," he said. He seemed in a hurry to get it over with now, and I could see Mrs. Pratchett's skinny goat's legs trotting to keep up with him. They had already inspected one side of the playground. We watched them moving down the 2nd side and then the 3rd. "Still too big," I heard Mrs. Pratchett croaking. "Much too big. Smaller than these, smaller. Where's them nasty little ones?" They were coming closer to us now. Closer and closer. And they were starting on the 4th side. Every boy in our form was watching Mr. Coombs and Mrs. Pratchett as they came walking down the line towards us. "Nasty cheeky lot, those little ones. They comes into my shop and they thinks they can do what they darn well likes." Mr. Coombs made no replies to this. They nick things when they ain't looking, she went on. They put their grubby hands all over everything and they've got no manners. I don't mind girls. I never have no trouble with girls, but boys is hideous and horrible, and I don't have to tell you that, now do I, Headmaster? These are the smaller ones, Mr. Coombs said. I could see Mrs. Pratchett's piggy little eyes staring hard at the face of each boy that she passed. Suddenly she let out a high-pitched yell and pointed a dirty finger straight at Thwaites. That's him, she yelled. That's one of them. I'd know him a while away, the scummy little bounder. The entire school turned to look at Thwaites. What have I done? He stuttered, appealing to Mr. Coombs. Mrs. Pratchett's eyes flicked over and settled on my own face, and I looked down and studied the black asphalt surface of the playground. Here's another of them, I heard her yelling. That one there. She was pointing at me now. You're quite sure, Mr. Coombs said. Of course I'm sure, she cried. I never forgets a face, least of all when it's as sly as that. He's one of them, all right. There were 5 of us all together. Now, what would happen next? The other 3, as I knew very well, were coming up next. Mrs. Pratchett's face was glimmering with venom as her eyes travelled beyond me down the line. There they are, she cried, stabbing there with her finger. Him, and him, and him. That's the 5 of them, all right. We don't need to look no farther than this, Headmaster. They're here, all of them here, the nasty, dirty little scoundrels. You've got their names down, have you? I've got their names, Mrs. Pratchett, Mr. Coombs told her. I'm much obliged to you. And I'm much obliged to you, Headmaster, she answered. And as Mr. Coombs led her away across the playground, we heard her saying, Right in the jar of Gobstoppers it was, a stinking dead mouse which I will never forget as long as I live. You have my deepest sympathy, Mr. Coombs was muttering. Talk about shocks, she went on. When my dead fingers caught hold of that nasty, soggy, stinking dead mouse, and her voice trailed away as Mr. Coombs led her quickly through the door into the school building. So I hope you enjoyed that story so far. The next chapter is called Mrs. Pratchett's Revenge, and there's a picture of the cane, and of course all those years ago punishment would have been reporting to the headmaster's office for the cane. Anyway, Year 6, I do hope that you're keeping well and that you are managing to keep busy, getting some fresh air and also doing the work that we've set to you in your pack. Look out for the communications that we're giving you each week. I know there's a one that's going out today for you. Miss you loads, take care and keep watching for the next instalment. Bye-bye then. Bye.